herzlich willkommen zum, ich weiß nicht wievielten Abend in diesem Programm oder Autorinnen-Treffen in diesem Programm. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Valzhyna Mort und Lana Bastasic bei uns sind. Do you hear us? Is it okay? Ja, ja. Zwei Schriftstellerinnen, die etwas gemeinsam haben, nämlich sie leben nicht mehr in dem Land, aus dem sie kommen. Sie sprechen eine Sprache perfekt, die nicht ihre Muttersprache ist, wobei ich auch da einige Fragen stellen werde, in welcher Sprache eigentlich wer spricht und schreibt. Rechts von ihnen außen sitzt Lana Bastasic. Sie kommt aus dem früheren Jugoslawien, wurde 1986 in Zagreb geboren. Sie lebt heute, wenn das richtig ist, in Barcelona. Sie hat mehrere Erzählbände geschrieben, Lyrik verfasst und einen sehr schönen Roman geschrieben, der in ihrer jugoslawischen Kindheit spielt, aber auch von einer großen Reise handelt, um diese Vergangenheit zu erforschen. Fang den Hasen, daraus werden wir gleich etwas hören. Und Valzhyna Mort, wenige Jahre älter, kommt aus Belarus und hat dieses Land bereits 2006 verlassen und lebt heute in den USA. Sie ist Lyrikerin und die erste Frage, die ich Ihnen beiden stellen möchte: In welcher Sprache schreiben Sie? Lana, vielleicht antworten Sie als Erste.
It's a hard question to start with. But first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm really happy to be here with one of my favorite contemporary poets. So, which language? It's quite a political question. Whatever I answer, somebody will get angry in the Balkans. So, and
we are not in the Balkans here.
Yeah, we are always in the Balkans, but some of us. But I refer to it as Serbo-Croatian, not because of any kind of Yugoslav nostalgia, but because as somebody who studied linguistics, it just makes sense to me. At the same time, I think everybody has the right to refer to it whatever way they're comfortable, as long as they're not oppressing somebody else's choice. I think it's sad that trying to split this language into four nationally pure languages is actually stripping our literature and literatures of richness and vocabulary and poetry and rhythm. So right now, actually, using one word or another word in this language is a political act in itself.
And how do you tell what's the name of your language? Is it Serbo-Croatian? Is it BCSM, or what is it exactly?
Well, I always like to say the beautiful thing is that the language doesn't care what we call them. We are the ones who need to name it something, but the language just doesn't really care. And I tend to say Serbo-Croatian, but my books in libraries in the Balkans are cataloged under Bosnian, Serbian, Serbo-Croatian, BS, whatever. It just sounds so wrong. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really matter to me. I just refer to it as Serbo-Croatian because it's also to me the only way to just kind of show its history and richness and annoy nationalists at the same time.
What about you, Valzhyna?
Well, guten Abend, good evening. And with Lana, well, I'll jump straight to the question. I write in two languages at once, in English and in Belarusian, and I work with two drafts side by side, or if I don't work with them side by side, then I know that I'm not done with my text until I have it in the other language. Like most Soviet Belarusian children, I grew up in a Russian-speaking family, so neither of these languages, English or Belarusian, are my mother tongues, so to say. I think that for a lot of people who come out of this colonial condition. It's common to have a difficult relationship with the idea of having a mother tongue. Generally, surprisingly, Belarusian literature has been traditionally multilingual. So there's Belarusian literature written in Russian, in Belarusian, in Yiddish, in different dialects on the southern border, close to Ukraine, or to the western border, where the borders always shifted. And so I just add English to it. But my relationship with the language as a writer is a kind of a masochistic one. I think that for me, my work always begins in a kind of a silence and muteness and inability to speak. And then for a long time, Belarusian was a kind of a mask almost, because it was not the language of my school teachers, for instance. It was not the language of authority, so to say, in Belarus. And then English became another mask, and perhaps a less claustrophobic one. At home, I was brought up by my grandmother, who spoke a language that doesn't have a name. It was just a mixture of things, because she was a woman who never received an education because of World War II. And so she spoke what we call trasyanka. And for a long time, I thought that she spoke Russian. And only later, I learned that it was trasyanka that we spoke mostly at home. And then in school, there was Russian that I really detested school, and on TV there was Russian and Belarusian, and that was also pretty unpleasant to hear and to watch. And so for me, I think my language is music. Whenever I hear it, I go for it. And when I started reading poetry in English, which doesn't mean English language poetry, but poetry from around the world translated into English, I could really hear a voice for myself in it.
Wir werden jetzt ein Stückchen hören aus dem jüngsten Gedichtband
We will now hear something from Lužina Mort.
und Auferstandenen. Dieses Buch wurde übersetzt von Katharina Nabutowicz aus dem Belarussischen und von Uljana Wolf aus dem Englischen. Uljana Wolf, die gestern den Preis der Leipziger Buchmesse in der Kategorie Sachbuch für ihr poetisches Werk, über ihre poetischen Essays gewonnen hat. Und wir hören jetzt die Lesung auf Deutsch der Übersetzung von Uljana Wolf.
Haltestellen, Ars Poetica. Nicht Bücher, sondern eine Straße öffnete mir den Mund wie ein Löffel Medizin. Nacheinander stellten die Straßen sich vor mit ihren Mördernamen. In den staatlichen Archiven kleben die Aktendeckel fest verkrustet am Blut der Statistikbögen. In einer kleinen Wohnung schuf ich mir in mir eine eigene Kammer. In einer kleinen Wohnung schuf ich mir in mir eine eigene Kammer, bevölkerte sie mit Kalibanen, meinen Zukunftsplänen. Einer Zukunft, die nach dem Tram-Fahrplan geht, vom Zoo bis zum Zirkus, solcherlei Zukunft. Und, liebe Zukunft, wie lautet dein Alibi für die Statistikbögen, die Straßen, die Wohnung? In der Knipsbörse, 3 Kriege hindurch, barg sie die Geburtsurkunden der Toten, versteckte Großmutter vor mir die Schokolade. Die Börse öffnet sich wie der Mund zum Schrei. Die Börse öffnete sich wie der Mund zum Schrei. Ihre 2 Kullerknöpfe verfolgten mich durch die Wände, die Tage, das ganze Tamtam. Und, liebe Börse, wer hat dir beigebracht, das Schreckgespenst zu sein. Ich küsse deine Knöpfe, schwöre treuen Dienst. August, Äpfel, ich bin ganz allein. Der Apfel ist herangereift, soll er meine Familie sein. Und der vierbeinige Tisch, die Katze. In der Kirche Supermarkt reihe ich mich ein wie eine Kerze in die Schlange zu den Priesterinnen. Sie bewahren das Wissen um die Fleischpreise, die Virginität der Milchverpackungen. Meine Zukunft? Ein Fitzel Kleingeld. Zukunft, die nach dem Tramfahrplan geht. Die Straßen stellten sich vor mit ihren Mördernamen. Ich aber schuf in mir eine eigene Kammer. Dort räumt die Erinnerung, illegale Zeitmigrantin, fleißig auf hinter der Einbildungskraft. In der Kammer, wo die Erinnerung das Bettzeug abzieht, das Laken, das fest verkrustet klebt an der Matratze, küsse ich die Äpfel, meine Brüder, küsse die Knöpfe, die uns verfolgen, durch die Wände, die Tage, das ganze Tamtam, küsse die Schokolade aus Großmutters Börse, 3 Kriege hindurch, barg sie die Geburtsurkunden der Toten. Halt mich, Bruder Apfel.
Vielen Dank. Wenn wir jetzt Zeit hätten, dann hätte ich Valzhyna Mort gefragt, was jeder von uns aufmerksamen Zuhörerinnen gehört hat, wie sie es geschafft hat, diese musikalische Struktur mit den kleinen Wiederholungen und mit dieser Stretta am Ende, wo mehrere Verse wieder aufgerufen werden und zusammengebunden werden, wie sie das eigentlich ins Werk gesetzt hat. Ich möchte aber, weil wir zu zweit hier sprechen, zu dritt, fragen, die 3 Kriege, die deine Großmutter durchgemacht hat und das Geburtszertifikat, das sie versteckt hat, ist deine Großmutter deine Muse?
Muse.
Yeah, I think so. She's sometimes she's a muse, sometimes she's more of a demon. Yeah, it depends on a day. I grew up with her stories. She was born in the late 20s of the past century, so in rural Belarus, which means that she lived through the Stalin's collectivization of the villages. Then she was orphaned before the World War II began, and after the war she was a disabled, uneducated single mother. But she knew that her experience was very special. She had a poet in her. She was very lyrical, so she thought that her experience, which is basically the vitamin pill of the 20th century, that does the opposite of healing you. Yeah, she didn't see herself as part of history at all, but she was looking all the time for her idea of beauty in everything, beautiful people, beautiful music. And she knew she belonged in literature. And she had me, her oldest grandchild. I was very easy to manipulate. And so every day when I would come back from school, she would sit me at the table, put lunch in front of me, and start retelling me the whole story of her life. And so, you know, as a child, I was born in 1981, so I was 4 when Chernobyl happened, I was 10 when the Soviet Union collapsed. I know nothing of it. But my story is the story of surviving the 30s, surviving the 40s, being a single, disabled, uneducated woman, mother in the Soviet Union. I know very, very little of the history that I should have witnessed, because my story is her story, and she told these stories to me very intentionally. She wanted to be literature. And so she wanted me to write about her. And when I started writing, she would always make sure that I am writing indeed about her. But here's something that happened when she passed, and I thought now I could actually write about her. It turned out that, of course, I could not. Her story was completely her own. It belonged in her body, in her voice, and my relationship with her was very physical, which is also my relationship, I think, with the 30s, with the 40s, with the 50s, because you imagine that this is somebody who has witnessed the heart of the 20th century atrocities, survived miraculously, knew that her survival was a miracle, knew that she had to tell her story, but she also, you know, washed my hair in the bathtub, she cooked my meals, she stroked my hand when I had a bad day. So my relationship with this history is also through her body. And her story was inside her body, inside her hands, inside her neck, inside her breasts. When that was gone, I had nothing. And that's why when I say that I write out of a kind of muteness, out of silence, it's true that she is my muse, and I try very hard to speak as clearly as possible about what it means to be a grandchild of a survivor, what it means to survive the survivor, how traumatizing survivors can be to obedient children, how traumatizing the stories of war can be, and how little actually they do to prepare you for anything. So I tried to find language for it, but it's not hers. I know her story by heart, but I cannot repeat it. It's gone, it's completely inside her body. And now that she has been gone for many years, I try to look inside my own body and say, you know, where is she, where am I? What kind of language is there to talk about the two of us?
Die Sprache spielt auch bei Lana Bastasic eine ganz besondere Rolle. Dieses Buch, aus dem wir auch gleich ein Stück hören werden, beginnt mit einem unvollständigen Satz und es endet mit einem unvollständigen Satz und beide schließen sich. Es ist ein fantastischer kompositorischer, ich würde nicht sagen Trick, sondern es kommt aus der Logik der Geschichte heraus. Und die Geschichte beginnt damit, dass die Ich-Erzählerin, die in Dublin lebt, einen Anruf bekommt von einer Freundin, ihrer besten Freundin, mit der sie seit ungefähr 12 Jahren keinen Kontakt mehr hat, und die sagt zu ihr, komm nach Mostar. Und natürlich weiß sie nicht, was sie mit diesem Out-of-Blue-Anruf machen soll. Und sie sträubt sich, und erst als die andere am Telefon sagt, Armin ist in Wien, da kauft sie sich ein Ticket. Und dann trifft sie ihre frühere Schulfreundin wieder, erkennt sie kaum wieder, und die beiden steigen in ein Auto und machen so einen Roadtrip über den Balkan, über eine vom Krieg versehrte Landschaft. Und am Ende finden sie tatsächlich Armin, aber sie finden nicht ihn, sondern sie finden im Museum den Hasen von Dürer, den Armin als 7-jähriger Junge angeschaut hat. Und ich muss ganz neugierig fragen, Lana, lebt Armin noch, der verschwundene Bruder von Leila und Freund von Sarah, oder nicht?
Everything is in the book, but thank you for reading. It was for me an important question of Armin and of his disappearance. And that was an ethical question, the question of, am I allowed to produce a happy catharsis from a story that in most cases did not have happy endings? Can I use suffering from other people, from my hometown, to make readers happy? And I felt like that was ethically problematic. And what I wanted the reader to feel was the same kind of hope and hopelessness that those families felt, whose loved ones were never found, and they never had a happy catharsis. So it is what starts the story, but at the end, I didn't want to have a sad ending. I wanted there to be an education for my narrator who believes in happy stories with a deep meaning. And it was an education for both her and the reader to see that some stories don't have an ending. And especially in the Balkans, where I feel like we still, all those stories from the 90s still resonate and are never ending. And when you open the daily newspaper, it's the same language, it's the same metaphors, it's the same narrators, it's the same frame, narrative frame, so it doesn't really end. And that's why I chose not to have an ending and to have the question of Armin's whereabouts open. Just like, you know, I feel like not knowing is even worse, maybe, than death. And in this case, it was precisely the not knowing of mothers, of wives, of sisters, of daughters, that kind of created this black hole that went down generations. So that is I cannot give you, unfortunately, I cannot give you the answer. But I hope the book itself forms a kind of important question.
Wir werden jetzt erstmal ein Stückchen hören und dann sprechen wir weiter. Wir hören eine Passage aus dem ersten Drittel des Buches in der Übersetzung von Rebecca Zeinzinger.
Ich weiß nicht, wer es mir gesagt hat. Jetzt kommt es mir vor, als wäre es schon immer so gewesen. Es hatte nie ein Davor gegeben. Armin verschwand, nachdem alle Hunde gestorben waren, nachdem er mir das Haar gelöst hatte, nach deiner ersten Regel. Er verwandelte sich von einem lebendigen Menschen in ein letztes Bild. Ihr, du und ich in eurem Garten, neben dem Kirschbaum, dein Ohrring in meiner Hosentasche. Damals wusste ich nicht, dass ich, von Gras, Zigarettenrauch und meinem ungeordneten Haar umgeben, schon Teil einer zukünftigen Erinnerung war. Ich weiß nicht mehr, was ich anhatte, worüber wir danach sprachen, ob ich mich von euch verabschiedet habe, bevor ich nach Hause ging. Ich erinnere mich nicht, weil mir niemand gesagt hat, dass ich mir all das merken sollte. Jedes Mal verliere ich noch ein Stückchen des Bildes. Es verschwinden der Klee, die Häuser im Hintergrund, die Wäsche auf dem Balkon. Armin blieb unverändert in diesem vereinfachten Garten übrig, ein 16-jähriger Junge, der nach einem nicht vorhandenen Ohrring im Klee sucht. Jede Erinnerung an ihn vor diesem Ereignis wurde durch diese neue Erkenntnis auf einmal vergiftet. Jeder Armin davor, der von deinem 7. Geburtstag, der in deinem Zimmer, der vor dem Kirschbaum, wurde zu einem Armin, den es nicht mehr gab. Ich weiß nicht, wie ich es erfahren habe, es ist übrigens auch nicht wichtig. Ich erinnere mich nur, dass die Stadt anders war, als ob ihr jemand alle Lebensgeister ausgesaugt hätte. Es gab immer mehr Dunkelheit, immer mehr abgesagte Schulstunden, immer mehr Gebete in den Tageszeitungen. Es gab immer weniger Zeitschriften, immer weniger Musik, immer weniger Lebensmittel. Die Dunkelheit breitete sich aus, als ob ein boshaftes Kind sie über uns ausgeschüttet hätte. Meine Mitbürger bekamen schlagartig andere Gesichter. Manche runzelten nur einmal die Stirn und behielten diesen Ausdruck für immer. Andere verschwanden auf Nimmerwiedersehen, ohne großes Aufsehen davon zu machen. Später war ich gut darin, Fremden etwas vorzulügen. Ich war klein, sagte ich dann, ich wusste ja gar nicht, was da passierte. Aber das stimmt nicht. Wir wussten es, du und ich. Wir wussten, dass es begonnen hatte, dass sie es begonnen hatten. Wir wussten auch, dass es dauern würde. Schon bald wurde es zu einer Konstante, wie ein zusätzliches chemisches Element in der Luft. Es war leicht auszusprechen wie Guten Morgen oder Gute Nacht. Es war überall im Lindenbaum hinter der Schule, in den Kinderzeichnungen an der Wand der Schultoilette, in den Lehrern, die auf einmal nur noch Kyrillisch schrieben. Es war auch in dir, in deinem neuen Namen und leeren Gesicht. Es saß an einem Tisch mit Armins Verschwinden. Du verbrachtest immer mehr Zeit zu Hause, ummauert von der Angst deiner Mutter wie von Zement. Eines Morgens fandet ihr Fäkalien vor eurer Tür, menschliche, auf einem Haufen. Du sagtest zu mir, dass du noch nie so viel Exkrement auf einmal gesehen hattest. Jemand hat sich richtig Mühe gegeben. Doch euch war es egal. Armin hatte die Angst, das Unbehagen und die Scham mit sich genommen und daraus zweitklassige Emotionen gemacht. Um in die Stadt zu gehen, dachte ich mir Ausreden aus. Das ganze Jahr trieb ich mich herum, obwohl mein Vater es mir verboten hatte. Hinter dem Zaun der verlassenen Saftfabrik sah ich jeden Tag den Geist des kleinen, dreifarbigen Jagdhundes Lux, wie er auf der Suche nach einem Knochen verloren herumstrich. Er störte mich nicht. Es war tröstlich, während meiner erfolglosen Fahndungen auf ihn zu treffen. Er erinnerte mich an das, was davor war, daran, dass es ein Davor gab. Ich war davon überzeugt, dass ich Armin irgendwo treffen würde, dass ich diejenige sein würde, die ihn finden und zurückbringen würde. Als ob er den Weg nach Hause nicht selbst gefunden hätte. Damals wollte ich noch nicht zugeben, dass unsere Stadt für so etwas viel zu klein war. Dort konnten sich Leute nicht verirren, sie verschwanden einfach. Und noch eine Erinnerung. Der Tag, an dem ich beschlossen hatte, dir den gestohlenen Ohrring wiederzugeben. Als ich das letzte Mal da gewesen war, hatte mir Armin unter eurem Kirschbaum den Pferdeschwanz aufgebunden. Und jetzt diese Leere, das Tor, das auf einmal ein anderes war, und der kurze Weg zu eurer Eingangstür, hinter der ein unabsehbares Vakuum klaffte. Du machtest auf und batest mich, die Schuhe auszuziehen. Der Schnee war wie immer halb geschmolzen und schmutzig. Schweigend gehorchte ich und trat in den dunklen Flur. Armins Fehlen erfüllte den Raum mehr, als es seine Anwesenheit jemals getan hatte. Als ob jemand die Decke unbemerkt um 5 Zentimeter heruntergelassen hätte und die Wände sich nachts einander schweigend angenähert hätten. Ich bemerkte, dass in eurem Flur und Wohnzimmer viel weniger Dinge waren. Verschwunden waren der große Gobelin mit den 2 Rehen, die große hölzerne Uhr oberhalb des Fernsehers, dann auch der Fernseher. Fast alles, was ihr besaßt, hattet ihr verkauft. Einschließlich der Teller mit den bunten Würfeln, von denen ich einmal deine Geburtstagstorte gegessen hatte. Auch den Großteil deiner Barbies habt ihr verkauft, außer einer einzigen, der Ärztin mit den schwarzen Haaren. Aber das war dir nicht wichtig. Barbies waren wie Emotionen zweitrangig geworden.
Vielen Dank. Ich glaube, ich habe noch nie so ein unheimliches und genaues Buch über diesen die Kriege im früheren Jugoslawien gelesen und die ethnische Säuberung. Dadurch, dass es ein Buch ist über die Kindheit, hat es eine ganz sonderbare Zeitlichkeit. Es sind sowohl diese Kindheitsepisoden da, die an ein Du gerichtet sind, als auch eine Gegenwartsebene, in der die beiden Freundinnen durch dieses Gelände, ein Nachkriegsgelände mit den ganzen unverheilten Wunden, zerstörten Moscheen und dunklen Orten fahren. Und der dunkelste Ort ist das frühere Zuhause Banja Luka. Wie haben Sie das geschafft? Also wie war das möglich? Wie haben Sie dieses Buch begonnen zu schreiben?
I still feel I would prefer to listen to Valzhyna, but I can do this. It wasn't easy. I was living in a different country. I was living in a different language, and these ideas kept coming back. And at the moment, I was really struggling with night terrors, sleep paralysis, and I had a lot of nightmares. And then I tried doing therapy in Spanish, which I do not recommend. Yeah, right? It's so interesting when you realize you cannot do therapy in a different language. So I realized, okay, I left something behind, and I need to go back and explore this. And it felt like a sort of darkness. But at the same time, this darkness felt like home. It wasn't a completely negative darkness. It was also a feeling of, it is darkness, but it is mine. I know how to navigate in it. Maybe I miss it. What is there? So I wanted to go back, and I started writing about this woman who, to me, in a way, represented my country. And so I realized I wanted to have these two dimensions. I wanted to have the spatial dimension of the road where they're moving, but it feels like time has stopped. Mm-hmm. And there's this space that's kind of frozen in time, and has been since the war. And the other dimension would be the temporal dimension, where the narrator goes back in time and remembers, but they stay in the same town, which is my hometown of Banja Luka. I wasn't born there, but I grew up there. And then I wanted to see how these two inform each other and influence each other, and also kind of start deforming each other, how memories are deformed by the present moment. And of course, childhood, it's always an interesting thing for me to talk about, because when you are a child during wartime, it's not like you can put a pause on your childhood and think, when this is over, I will continue. No, your childhood has to go on in whatever way it can. So it was, in a way, these years of magical thinking, to borrow a title from Joan Didion, but in a way, all of these things that were happening, we didn't quite understand them, but at the same time, we had an inner kind of understanding that something is not right. And you try to explain it with the cognitive abilities that you have as a child, and you try to explain it with the language and vocabulary that you have as a child, and you're always reaching a kind of wall, because something just doesn't make sense, and you're just supposed to accept it. So this is what I wanted to portray. And then how can you, after this, how does this influence you growing up into an adult, developing a language, developing, a view of the world, of people, when you started in such nonsense that is war, because war essentially is nonsense.
Wahrscheinlich, you admire.
bevor wir
admire very much the metaphors and the abundance of and richness of Lana's language. Would you like to comment a little bit on it? Because it would be like, it was really lovely to hear you.
Yes, Katharina, thank you. And I really loved the question about the child perspective, because it's one of the things that I appreciated so much in the novel. Because an adult protagonist couldn't have not commented on the historical facts. That would have been blindness, right, and kind of maybe implication. You would be implicated in atrocities if you close your eyes to them. But the child's perspective allows to say, no, I insist on a private, intimate experience inside this atrocity. And I think that that's what I love so much about the book, how it insists on a private life inside a life that is not private, and it's not even your own, right? You're at the mercy of these events that are so much bigger than you, of all of these types of violence. Yet the child insists on a childhood, insists on a child point of view, and on privacy in that, on privacy and a private experience that is just your own. And the lyrical in the novel is what I love so much. Of course, I'm a lyrical poet, so I respond to it immediately. And the lyrical there, again, I think allows it not to become like a historical realism or something like that. Yeah. Because lyric, first of all, lyric for me is always about a slippage. It's about losing control. So we go into lyric not knowing what we're going to pull out of ourselves. Yet Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish poet, was saying that the essence of, in the gist of poetry, in the heart of poetry, is something indecent, because it reveals something inside of us that we didn't know was inside us. It makes private public, private even from ourselves. And so in lyric, we lose control, and we say things we do not want to say, do not mean to say. And here in this novel, too, the lyric works this way, because it saves, I think, the author and the narrator from turning to a historical realism. Instead, all the slippages are into poetry. And that insists on that kind of ownership, actually, of that's the answer to the violence of history, right? You're not going to tell my story, but I'm going to tell my story, and my story is all about, you know, it's private. It's about private feelings that are so much bigger, to the child than the big atrocities that are happening. What are they to her? To Sarah, when she has this girlfriend and she's in love and, you know, she lost her virginity, it's all so much bigger than the historical. And I think that's honest. That just, that's what I love about it.
Thank you so much, Valzhyna.
And I know that we will never find the brother, right? The once we
spoiler.
Oh.
No, I'm kidding.
No, it was not spoiled yet by Katharina.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I don't believe in spoilers. It's just, to me, it's so funny.
Because this is also the lyrical in the novel for me, is that once we get attached to the brother, we know that there is no way there could be a happy ending. It's impossible. Because then all of the lyric, all of the metaphors, all of the beautiful language would be empty. It would empty it out, exactly. The happy ending. It would just say, look, it was all just pretty. Yeah, and here's a happy ending. But it's pretty, it's beautiful, precisely because of the loss and the trauma and the atrocity and the violence. So you enjoy these metaphors, you enjoy these beautiful humor and descriptions, but underneath it is loss and fear of the reality. And that's the tension there between the poetry and the reality.
Thank you so much.
Ganz herzlichen Dank. Was mich auch sehr beeindruckt hat, ist
about the child, this Sarah, who destroyed a sparrow. She just smashed him with her boot in the snow, and she was sort of agitated and forced and pushed by her peers to do that. And this is one of these very subtle things you wrote about how deeply violence went into kids.
Yes. I'm really happy you noticed that moment, because it was like a pivotal moment in the book for me. This kind of turning point where a child is initiated into the world of violence, and also she's initiated into the world of boys, because those boys are just accepting this role they have, because they don't have any other choice. So they're suffering as much as their fellow girl friends, and she realizes that she needs to be accepted by this world, because what is the other option? And the only way to be accepted into this club is to perform this act of violence that parades for bravery, but is not bravery, because she's destroying something that's much weaker and smaller than she is. And I just felt like precisely what Valzhyna was saying about, instead of writing a historical war novel, because we have had those, I feel like it is precisely in these small human moments, and sometimes even inhuman, like with animals, where you can see the atrocities in a much stronger way. For example, there is this beautiful part in Alexander Hammond's book, in My Parents, an Introduction, where he describes his father's bees. His father was a beekeeper, and he had a lot of these beautiful beehives. I'm not sure what the exact word is for those little houses for bees, beehives, I think. And then somebody just destroyed all of them when the war went through the village. They killed all the bees because they knocked these beehives down, and then the father comes back and looks at dead bees in the snow. And to me, this image is so much more powerful than, maybe a newspaper article, because you realize what nonsense it is to do such a thing. Bees that
to the most innocent creatures.
The most innocent creatures that give us so much and take really nothing in return. So this is where why I wanted animals also to play such an important part in the novel, because nobody in the Balkans could tell me, oh, but this is a Serbian dog. Why are you writing about a Serbian dog and not about... Because this is what they do with people. And I feel like it's just as stupid and nonsensical to do this. But nobody can tell me that this sparrow was a Muslim or an Orthodox or a Catholic. It's just life that is no longer there. And with that boot going into the snow, a hole appears. And I wanted this black hole to kind of start swallowing everything. It's just a little start. And the only antidote is the friend, the best friend, who is looking at Sara, who killed the bird, not saying anything, but that's where Sara feels, I did something wrong. I'm still too young to realize why this is wrong, but because of the way you're looking at me, I feel like this is wrong. And for me, there's hope that other people who really love us and people that we love, can show us, can teach us, can tell us when we are at our worst, and maybe stop this initiation.
This reminds me of a moment in Svetlana Alexievich's Was Unwomanly Face, where one of the women speaks and describes the corpses of people who were killed and the horses that are nearby, and the speaker says, how could they do it in front of the horses? And this question really moved me, even though the horses are not murdered there, but that kind of a sense that it's done in front of these animals really troubles the speaker, because this is something she remembers some decades later, and it stays with her. And now, of course, when the bombings in Ukraine began, you saw everywhere the images of people saving their pets, but then at some point I could not look anymore at any photographic evidence, which just floods, of course, the internet floods social media and the voyeurism of it. There's a sense that you are sitting in the audience while people hiding in the cell of an actual theater are being bombed is unbearable, and I cannot look at these images. And one of the images that really stopped me when I said, no, I cannot look anymore and be a voyeurist, was not the image of people or of animals. It was the image of a shelled library. And so the wall was down, and there were just books that fell down from the shelves. You see the shelves, and they're all crooked. And that was an unbearable image for me to look at this bombed down library.
This was my question too, how you relate on the current war, because do you write? Do you have friends in Ukraine? Do you call them up, or how do you relate to them?
Well, it's always hard. I mean, you don't want to make it about yourself, you know. You don't want to say I'm suffering, because people are actually suffering. And I know people who escaped, especially I was following writer Katharina Babkina, who had to leave Kiev with her child, and they were stranded at the Polish border for 3 days. And you just feel helpless, but at the same time, you know, I was talking about this, the last event, which right now I can't remember where it was completely. I feel like everything that's happening, I've been losing language and memory, but I feel like in the Balkans, every time you write about the war and talk about the war, there was always someone who would say, isn't it enough already? Why are you constantly talking? Why are you going back to this? Don't you have something happy to? Can't you write a love novel, etc.? And I always kept saying and insisting that we have to keep talking about this, because this can happen again, and it can happen anywhere. Let's not make this a Balkan thing. Let's not make this something that happens in, you know, that dark, uncivilized land, which is neither dark or uncivilized. It happened to us at our best, when nobody thought it would happen. And we have to keep talking about it, because it could happen anywhere. And I feel like now the world is, or at least Europe is realizing that we are never really safe. And this is scary for many people, whereas for us in the Balkans, it was more of an echo of, here it is again. So it's sad to say that there was no surprise, but there was a sense of failure. That, you know, all those, and I was thinking, all those books we wrote about what happened, all the images you all saw in the news if you weren't there, all the newspapers, and yet we have failed, because it's here again. And this is why we have to keep talking about it and finding new ways of talking about it, especially what Valzhyna was saying, in the little things, in that, you know, the image of the library, even though it is very hard to watch, but we have to remember what is destroyed in wars, because in the end, you know, it's not going to be about Putin or Biden or even President Zelensky. It's going to be, you know, 20, 30, 50 years from now, these things echoing down and destroying generations, really generations. And this is why for me it was especially hard to see this. And also right now I'm in Belgrade, I'm based in Belgrade in Serbia. And Serbia is one of the very few countries that did not impose sanctions on Russia. And again, I find myself in a way at the wrong side of history. And that's also a terrible feeling where you see children who are like 15 or 16 walking down the street with Russian flags because they are Orthodox brothers or whatever. And right now, Serbian economy is suffering probably the most in Europe. We have terrible inflation. But again, it's this myth, this myth of masculinity that is coming to cleanse and save and show us the true path. It's back. And it's back with the generations who don't even remember the war in the Balkans because the story survived.
I think we should put an end with a poem, Valzhyna. And because Lana wished to listen to you, I would ask you if, wenn Sie nichts dagegen haben, würde ich zum Abschluss,
If you're not against it, I'd like
das wir
to
vorhin
ask.
auf Deutsch gehört haben, auf Belarusisch liest oder auf Englisch.
Okay. So I don't get to speak on. Okay.
It was not a question. It was just I was asking you. It was a request if you could read this.
We also need
But do you
poetry
have
more
one?
than ever.
I have an English. Yes, I have.
Yes, I have. I'll read from here.
Yeah.
But I want to. Okay. So I have no time to say anything to the question. Sorry.
There was no question.
I like
Just-
talking. Okay.
Only a few lines, maybe.
Well, I will. So I want to say, because I will connect it to something that I said earlier. I grew up with the stories of war. I recited poems about war. I sang songs about war. As a child, I imagined what it would be like to be bombed. I imagined what it would be like to be tortured, and we all knew all the methods of it. But it has all of that language. It's completely useless right now. So right now, when I want to speak to my Ukrainian or Belarusian friends in Ukraine, I cannot even say hello. I have a great need to communicate with them, to make sure that they know I'm there for them. But the simplest words, like hello, how are you, it's completely shifted. The semantics of it, the meaning of it is completely shifted. And so I, a child whose whole psyche is shaped by war songs, yes, I see it in my Facebook Messenger, and I think, is it okay to say hello? Or I should use some other greeting? Or should I skip it altogether? There is absolutely no language. So we write and we talk, but it's only, I think this language is good only for our memory, but it's never here for us, for our reality. And I think we'll have those books about that private experience of what is happening right now, and they're going to be written later. Yeah.
Sorry, there's this, you reminded me of a quote by Margaret Atwood, war is what happens when language fails. And it's exactly this, and I feel like then what we have to do, especially you poets, you have all the response, but I think it's like then picking up all of this shattered language and trying to, put it in a different way and make something else with it.
I'm afraid of that burden. I would say that that poetry have not saved us for many centuries, because I think in the end it does not illustrate reality, it does not help us to understand reality, it only helps us to understand ourselves and to live with our own feeling of shame, of guilt, of inadequacy, but it does not really prepare us for anything.
But sometimes it gives us comfort. Because
yes.
it shows that people are able to shape something, to find words
Absolutely.
and form.
Yes.
And you can recur to it later, and then
Yes.
you will find
Yes.
something new which you haven't seen yet.
Yes, it does. It gives the form. I agree,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is why music does it supremely.
Mm-hmm.
And you asked where the music comes from. It comes from Bach. Yeah, Bach puts everything in order. Even though the poem is supposed to be on the Belarusian public buses. So I read in Belarusian. Ни книги, а вулица открыла мне рот, як лыжка лекара. Адна за адной вуліцы прадставіліся імёнамі забойцаў. У дзяржаўных архівах вокладкі праслі тромбамі да ўліковых кніг акрываўленых. У маленькай кватэры я збудавала сябе асобны пакой. У маленькай кватэры я збудавала сябе асобны пакой, засяліла яго калібанамі планаў на будучыню. Будучыня, што ходзіць па раскладзе грамадскага транспарту, ад зоапарка да цырка будучыня, які твой алібі на архівы, на вуліцы, на кватэры будучыня. У сумцы, якая трымала праз 3 вайны, пасведчанне аб нараджэнні мерцвякоў, бабуля хавала ад мяне шакалад. Сумка адкрывалася, як рот, што крычыць. Сумка адкрывалася, як рот, што крычыць. 2 спражкі назіралі за мной праз сцены, праз дні, праз джаз. Хто навучыў цябе, сумка, быць страшным тварам? Цалую спражкі, клянуся быць тваім служкам. Жнівень, яблыкі, у мяне нікога няма. Яблык пасмеў, вось мне і сям'я, і чацвераногі стол замест кота. У храме гастраному я ставлю сябе як свечку у чаргу да жрыцы, што ахоўвае веды коштаў на мяса, цнаслівасць упаковак з малаком. Мая будучыня крыху рэшты. Будучыня, што ходзіць па раскладзе грамадскага транспарту, вуліцы прадставіліся імёнамі забойцаў, а я збудавала з сябе асобны пакой, у якім памяць нелегальная эмігрантка праз час бясконца прыбірае за ўяўленнем. У пакоі, дзе памяць здымае бялізну з ложкаў, бялізну, што тромбамі прырасла да матрацаў, я цалую яблычкі, мае брацікі, цалую спражкі, што назіраюць за намі праз сцены, праз дні, праз джаз, шакалад з сумкі, якая трымала праз 3 вайны, пасведчанне аб нараджэнні мерцвякоў. Трымай мяне, яблычак.
Thank you.
Danke, Katharina.
Thank you.
Vielen, vielen Dank. Danke fürs Zuhören.
Danke to our translators.
Ja. Okay, gut.
Danke an die Dolmetscher.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much.